Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 10 of our discussion of Morgoth's Ring. And tonight, well, we're going to see. I'm going to try to finish the laws and customs of the Eldar, but this is such a delightful section of this book. I hope that you guys agree with me on that. I don't know if you like it or not, but I certainly find it very delightful and just so much fun to see Tolkien doing this. I loved, those moments in the history of the Lord of the Rings when these like world building moments, right? Like when Hobbit culture begins to emerge. Like remember that wonderful, when the characters who will later become Frodo and Sam and Pippin are walking across the Marish and they're, talking about throwing dirty dishes out the window and stuff like that. Like the whole context in which like all of the stuff about, Hobbit architecture and everything, begins to emerge. That's, it was always so much fun to see when world building happened to Tolkien, because it seemed to strike rather unpredictably, right? But it was always so much fun to see when it happened. And so seeing it happening again now, long after the Lord of the Rings is done, but to see it happening in regard to these legends, that we've already read so many different versions of and which are, have been familiar to us even for years, as they not quite so many years as they had been familiar to Tolkien already, but almost feels like that actually some days, since we started our history of Middle-earth series discussions. But anyway, it's delightful to see. So anyway, I'm having fun, so hope you guys will have fun in continuing to talk about this section tonight. We're gonna see if we get through laws and customs tonight. Quick reminder before we jump in, just wanted to remind you that our courses for our new Signum Path program are starting next week. In the beginning of June is our first ever set of Signum Path classes. We do have registration open for July and August as well, but I wanted to remind folks about that Signum Path program. Wonderful new opportunity from Signum, new professional development opportunity, gaining those humanities-based skills to help in folks' careers. I think this is going to be a really, really fruitful program for a lot of people. I'm delighted that we're able to offer it and am really excited about it moving forward. So I just wanted to remind everybody about that. It's not too late to sign up for classes even for this June. But of course, as I say, we also are open for July and August. So, yeah. Oh, that's interesting. James Levac points out that at this point in Tolkien's life, the Silmarillion was older to Tolkien than the Silmarillion is to anyone who read it when it came out in 1977. Like, we've still not been around the Silmarillion for as long as Tolkien had been at this time. It's true. It's fairly remarkable. We still have a few years to go to catch up to. But again, it really does put it into context, though, doesn't it, James? I mean, think about how long ago 1977 was when the Silmarillion came out. I know there are some people, possibly some people tonight who can, who remember that, for whom, who might have read the Silmarillion right after it was released. I remember listening, for instance, to Doug Anderson's story about how he cut class on the day after the Silmarillion came out. One of the few days in which he played hooky from school, and to read the Silmarillion the day after it came out. But anyway, yeah. So that's it is really to me. This I brought that up, about how long he'd been living with this stuff, just because it is to me a very remarkable development. Not just that he's revising, right? He's not just preparing for publication. He's not even just revising. He's reinventing. right? He's recontextualizing. He is revisiting these stories, thinking through these stories in completely new ways. Now, of course, to some extent, that's what I've been saying the whole time. We've been talking about Morgoth's Ring, right? But I feel that we can sort of see and hear and feel that more, right? More pointedly, or at least in a different way, here during the Laws and Customs of the Eldar section than we could. We kind of see it peeking around the corners at various places earlier on. But this is different, I would say. Certainly feels different to me. Yeah. Ah, cool. Yeah, there are several people here who remember the Silmarillion coming out. Mary does, and Arthur does. Yeah, absolutely. Good. Exactly, Brian. That's a really good way of sort of summarizing it, that we can see Tolkien trying to turn them from myths that he was writing in the Lost Tales phase to stories that make sense within the world that he has created. Absolutely. But of course, Brian, and I think we can see Tolkien sort of exerting himself in this way, right? His goal is not to make them less mythic. It's not to deprive them of, and that's the real delicacy, delicacy, not quite the right word. Delicateness, I suppose, is the word I mean. A delicacy is something quite different. Anyway, this is the delicate work that he's doing in retconning here to accomplish, Brian, exactly what you're describing, making these things into stories that make sense within the world that he's created, but yet also remaining mythic, retaining the mythic power that they always had, that drew him to them in the first place, right? And as we've seen already a couple times, if push comes to shove, right? If he has to choose between, his the myth and the story, he chooses the myth, right? And some of the inconsistencies that we see, like, for instance, the way in which we've already been noticing, for instance, kind of from afar to some extent. From afar, I mean, because we're not up to the stories of Luthien and Melian in the way that Christopher is presenting the revisions during this period. And yet, even from afar, we can see that Melian, as the mother, bearing a child, Luthien, to an elf, Thingol, is pushing in the opposite direction, or maybe to say it the other way around, where he's going with trying to make the Ainur in general, the Valar especially, fit into the story of the world. He is pushing in the opposite direction of where Melian has to be, right, in order for the myth of Luthien and Beren to happen. And yet he's certainly not kind of backing down from that. Now, Narnath, I like that name, on Twitch says, what was Tolkien's plan for Law and Customs? Who is the intended audience? That's really uncertain to me. I don't know to what extent... I'm not sure, honestly. I mean, think about some of the other things that Christopher publishes, like in Unfinished Tales. Think about the essay on the Astari. Think about the essay on the Palantiri, right? Stuff like that, right? There's a lot of things that he wrote during this time period, and we're talking about the same general time period as those things were written, in which it's not really clear who, or even in a sense, if there's an intended audience for this. Like, is there a volume in which he expects the Laws and Customs of the Eldar to be included? Even if the Silmarillion were to be published, if he were to complete this increasingly enormous task of fully integrating the Silmarillion stories into this new story world, this new narrative world, if he did that, would he include the laws and customs? Would it be maybe an appendix there? I'm not sure, but it's kind of a free floating text, right? Yeah, Tony was speculating, Brian, maybe something like an appendix to the Silmarillion. It's certainly, if anything, has a kind of flavor that's sort of like the flavor of some of the appendices to the Lord of the Rings. Yeah, Steven says it's almost like he's trying to develop an RPG source book before that's even a thing. Yeah, it is. And I agree with Kit, who I think is expressing a similar idea there, that basically his first audience is himself. He is working out these ideas first and foremost. And it may well be that was the intention in Laws and Customs, that it's not that he necessarily is expecting or planning to publish the text that he is currently writing in the form in which he currently writes it, but that he wants to articulate these things so as to help him in the project of going back and reworking, the stuff that he was working on. David, I that's the other thing that I was reflecting on as well, is the other sort of genre of Tolkien's work in the 1950s that this resembles are some of his letters, right? So many letters that he received asking questions would prompt significant quantities of world building in response, right? As if he hadn't really thought about this particular issue until someone asks the question. And when they do ask the question, he sometimes doesn't, want to give the answer, sometimes finds that he has the answer, right, and gives it. Anyway, so yeah, I don't know if this is something that he was intending to send to someone, perhaps, who was inquiring about this stuff. I don't know. I think that doesn't strike me as very likely. It doesn't feel like that, but that's a pretty squishy response, right? I certainly don't know. Yeah. Yana, I agree. Yana's question is, why wasn't more of this published as an appendix? I think Christopher has already... That is, Yana's question is, why didn't Christopher publish it anywhere? I mean, Christopher could have included it as an appendix to the Silmarillion. And Yana, it's to me in some ways even more striking that he didn't even include it in Unfinished Tales. We get all that stuff about Galadriel and Celeborn, right? Which I'm not complaining that we did, right? But I mean, he put all that stuff in, and a lot of that is really like speculative. Let me go back and do 4 different versions of the Galadriel and Celeborn story. So it doesn't seem like it's not like it wouldn't fit in there in some way. And as I already said, it strikes me as kind of similar in tone to the essay on the Astari. Certainly, it's more coherent than the essay on the Astari. Coherent, I mean, in the sense that the essay, the section on the Astari is a bunch of fragmentary things, some of which conflicts with itself, right? That Christopher gives. So this would seem clearly at least a more cohesive thing that he could have included, at least in Unfinished Tales, if not as an appendix. But I suspect the answer, and again, this is just sort of a guess on my part, I say just a guess. Let me modify that a little bit and say, based on the confessions that Christopher was making in the section right before this, when he was kind of opening his heart a little bit more about the choices that he made and sort of reflecting back on some of those choices and even openly regretting some of the choices that he made in his editorial time, in the mid-70s, before the Silmarillion was published. One of the things that he emphasized was that his primary focus at that time, in that earlier editorial period, was he was very concerned to eliminate apparent inconsistencies. Like I said, there's rival versions of stories in Unfinished Tales already, so that doesn't seem to have been driving him quite to that extent at that point. But there's no question that there are some parts of the laws and customs of the Eldar that are startling, and which I think probably, I would guess, failed his consistency test back when he was editing the Silmarillion, such that he would have felt that including it as an appendix to the Silmarillion would have raised far more questions in the minds of readers than it would have answered, perhaps. Anyway, yeah. Yeah, Robbie says, would there be any particular reason that Christopher might have published certain things in Unfinished Tales relative to a resurgence of interest in The Lord of the Rings in the late 70s to early 80s, trying to connect it to The Lord of the Rings more? Yeah, Robbie, I mean, certainly, obviously there is stuff in there, right? I mean, we get the poor, truncated, tragically unfinished chunk of the Tuor story, right? Of the long, newer Fall of Gondolin story, which Tolkien tragically didn't finish. We get the new material for the Turin Turambar story, right? The stuff which gets fully integrated into the text in the Children of Húrin later on. So like there's some Silmarillion bits, and then of course we get the Second Age stuff, Eldarion and Arendis and stuff, the Númenórean stuff. So it's not like everything in Unfinished Tales is all about Lord of the Rings all the time. But Robbie, I absolutely agree with you that I think that the primary motivator there was, when Unfinished Tales was published, was to give people what people wanted, which is more Lord of the Rings content, right? That has always struck me as the primary function, the number one function that Unfinished Tales fills, right? What he gave them, what he could tell them about wizards and Palantiri and Galadriel and Isildur and the disaster of the Gladden Fields, right? And the Fords of Isen and the Hunt for the Ring and the Quest of Erebor, right? And all these things have always been, right, of really great interest to Tolkien fans who love The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And that's got to be, I know it was for me when I first read Unfinished Tales, totally the selling point, right? That's if you think about it, then even the Silmarillion material that makes its way in, right, to Unfinished Tales is new story material, right? Here's some of the major stories that have been released in the Silmarillion, and here's like new versions that you've never read before, right? Which is different from something like the Laws and Customs Among the Eldar, right? Which would not have been perhaps quite as powerful in that way. And you're right, George, Turin is at least mentioned, right? In The Lord of the Rings, he comes up, right? So that's something, I suppose. But yeah, I know, Marie, Laws and Customs is not unfinished, right? I agree. Then there's that, right? That you have, it's why, from a certain perspective, it does seem to me simply odd that Christopher never did publish this, never did include it in any of the stuff. Until now, obviously. But to be totally honest, and I said this last week or the week before, even in Morgoth's Ring, he's buried this. Buried it. Is it even in the index? I don't even think it's in the index. And not the index, the table of contents. Is it in the table? Because I don't think it's in the table of contents. Let me look at the table of contents right now, because I don't think it is. As a subheading, yeah, it's as a subheading, like a part, just like, the Valaquenta, the earliest version, Laws and Customs Among the Eldar, later version of the story of Finwë and Miriel, of Feanor and the Unchaining of Melkor, as if it's just like a chapter or like a subheading, just like every other subheading, under the the section heading second phase of the later Quenta Silmarillion, right? Whereas again, if I had been publishing this, I would have been pretty tempted to be like Morgoth's Ring, featuring the Athrabeth and laws and customs among the Eldar, right? I mean, I'd have been, that would have been up in the big letters for me. But anyway, that's yeah, like I said, even in this volume, I don't feel like Christopher has done it anything like the justice that it deserves. And I feel like there's got to be a reason for that. And if I had to guess, I would go back to that. Even now, even though he was admitting earlier in this volume itself, just a few pages ago, within the context of where we are in the book, that he was overly concerned, perhaps, to present a consistent story. That in retrospect, he kind of wishes he'd left more of the uncertainties and inconsistencies in there. Even in that frame of mind, there seems to be something which leads him, I don't know what. Is it too strong to say to reject this, or not to shine the spotlight on it that it could well have received? That I think it would certainly bear if he'd wanted to do that. But anyway, yeah, yeah. Anyway, yeah. No, and Marie, you're right. Marie is pointing out, and this bears, Marie, I was forgetting about this element, but you're right, this element is very relevant to the question of who's the intended audience and what's going on here. Don't forget that, as Marie was just reminding me, it has the frame, right? I mean, the Ælfwine frame exists in the laws and customs of the Eldar. So it's, although it may well be, Kit, as you were suggesting before, like he himself is the primary audience of this as he's working through these ideas, it is part of the fictional frame, right? I mean, it partakes of that fictional frame. And even the way in which he, remember in the very beginning where he bracketed those first two paragraphs almost arbitrarily, as far as we can see, because they don't sound particularly preambulatory, and instead says, calls that Ælfwine's preamble, right? Which suggests that he wrote it, right? And then was actively imagining packaging it, right? Within the frame, the Ælfwine frame, the Book of Lost Tales frame that he's still utilizing, right? Still utilizing throughout these later texts. He's not only, it's not just that it spontaneously emerged within the context of that frame. It's that he is clearly, based on the marginal commentary, I say clearly, it would seem to me pretty clear, that he is imagining pushing it into, right? Adapting it further, or sort of integrating it more perfectly with the frame. And by the way, that makes me wonder if that's what he meant by Ælfwine's preamble. Maybe instead of isolating those two paragraphs and saying, I think that this is a perfect preamble by Ælfwine, instead, perhaps what he meant to indicate there was, we should replace, I'm going to replace this with a preamble from Ælfwine, or, Ælfwine's preamble needs to come before this, or something like that. I wonder if that's what he meant. In either case, whether he was envisioning a preamble by Ælfwine that he never wrote, or whether he was in some way going to recast those two paragraphs in order to be a preamble by Ælfwine, I'm not sure. But again, in either case, it certainly suggests that the process of forming this text into, in some sense, a sort of functioning part of the fictional whole that he was working on seems to be in his mind, right? So he certainly does seem to mean it for publication, or at least as much as the rest of it does. Exactly, Marie. The intention was there to make this what the elves told Ælfwine, right? So this is Ælfwine's, like, well, I was going to say anthropological study, right, of the elves, but that's not quite right. What would it be? The Eldarological study of the elves, something like that. You know, Alfwina's, I don't know, but yeah. Tony, it's an interesting question. How does the Bilbo frame he hints at in The Lord of the Rings fit into that choice? We have as yet seen nothing. And this is a thing worth noting, at least in passing, right? That for all that we've talked about the frame, and we have often reverted to that mention, right, to Bilbo's translations from the Elvish, and we know that that exists. Indeed, it was an even stronger element of the story in Tolkien's first version, as many of you will recall, in the first version of the Many Partings chapter and their departure to return home to the Shire from Rivendell. Originally, the books of lore, the translations from the Elvish, were given as a gift to Sam from Bilbo instead of the last drop of the Smaug vintage in order for Sam to get married. It was the books that he gave to Sam the first time. So we know that that element of the story, that concept of Bilbo, handing the lore, the Elvish lore that he has picked up in Rivendell, and propagating that among the hobbits through Frodo, but of course ultimately and primarily through Sam, was an idea that was in Tolkien's head from practically the beginning of the writing of the end of the story, right? So my point is, the concept of Bilbo as narrator and Sam as transmitter is there. And from the context of this text, not just this particular text, but almost all of the texts, no. I think absolutely all of the texts that we've been reading in Morgoth's Ring, that idea is already on the table, and yet there's not been a whisper of it. I don't recall anything that Tolkien himself wrote, any of the Tolkien texts from this period. Not Christopher's commentary, though Christopher certainly hasn't talked about it much either. But I don't remember anything that Tolkien's texts that we've been reading here in this book so far have said, which have hinted or pointed at the idea of Bilbo as narrator, as any kind of a shift or recontextualization or further layer, right? It could be Alfwina's text, Pengoa to Alfwina, and then like Bilbo. Yeah, it's obviously it's a different frame, right? But we haven't seen any hint of it. At least I haven't noticed any hint of it. And that's, to me, very interesting, because again, the idea is there already, been there for a long time, and that he's not ever even seemed to flirt with it in these entire texts is interesting to me, and also perhaps helps explain why Christopher felt so shy about it, and why that's the thing that he said in the preface to the first edition, or the preface to the first volume, right, the Book of Lost Tales Part 1, where he says that he regrets leaving hobbits entirely out, basically, of the Silmarillion, and because Tolkien didn't make explicit the fact that the Silmarillion was the translations from the Elvish that were handed from Bilbo to Frodo, that he, Christopher, didn't have the sort of courage to step into the breach and say, yep, totally, 100%, this is Bilbo's translations from the Elvish, because he felt like he didn't have 100% authorial certification of that. But again, as you'll remember in that preface, he kind of apologized for that and said that in retrospect he thought that was the wrong call. And yet, again, I think in Morgoth's Ring we can begin to see why he doubted it, right? I think perhaps many of us at the time were saying yeah, wow, Christopher, you really kind of dropped the ball on that one, right? Okay, there's caution, and then there's, caution is one thing and wavering is another, as someone else has said, right? Okay, maybe you could see that there's an argument against it, but come on, like, it's pretty clear that that's what was going on there, right? And it might seem perhaps, almost timorous of Christopher to have done that. And yet again, Morgoth's ring, I think, shows us why it was not timorousness on Christopher's part. He has some justification in that, as far as we can see, it's not on the radar screen, which is fascinating that it isn't. But yet, there it is, or there it isn't. Anyway, yeah. Yeah, exactly, Murray. No, I'm not questioning about the... you're right that, it was in the Lord of the Rings and kept in the Lord of the Rings and published there means that Tolkien considered that sort of a fixed and true idea. But yeah, exactly. It's the fact, as you say, Murray, that he had never picked that up and worked it through, right? He had never explained how the Alfwine Pengoad frame is going to... kind of could in some way be made to fit with a further Bilbo frame, or replaced it with a Bilbo frame at all. Okay. Anyway, this is all me doing a terrible job of making sure we get through the end of the laws and customs among the Eldar today. So let's get back into it. All right. Remember, we were talking about names, and we did father names and mother names last time. So let's look at some of these names, which are not in the Silmarillion, right? Just in case all of us wanted to be able to throw out more names to further confuse people already confused by the number of names in the Silmarillion. Finwë then named his second son by another mother, Indis, also Finwë, modifying it later to Nolo Finwë. But the mother name which Indis gave to him was Ingoldo, signifying that he was partly of both the Ingar, people of Ingwe, her own kin, and of the Noldor. By this name he also became generally known, though after the rule of the Noldor was committed to him by Manwë, in place of his elder brother and father, he took the name of Finwë and was in fact usually called Ingoldo Finwë. Similarly, the third son was Arafinwë, and also Ingalaure, because he had the golden hair of his mother's kin. So, yes, so those elves usually known as Fingolfin and Finarfin, eventually Finarfin, we finally come around to Finarfin now, I think. Yes, though with a PH, as I recall, at last reference. Anyway, it's he's giving us a glimpse, and I love this as a piece of retcon. It's like the Silmarillion has never even been published, right? Very few people have yet had the opportunity to drown in the sea of alternative names that are presented in the Silmarillion. But it's like, with the clear eye towards the future that he won't live himself to see, Tolkien is anticipating that will happen someday, and is delightfully telling us that indeed the names that we have in the record are but the tip of the nomenclature iceberg of these elves. So there we go. Yes, now Tony says this settles the hair color question for Finarfin. Yes, I would point out, though, we do not yet have a hair color question. The question of who has what hair color has never yet arisen explicitly in my memory. That is, there's been some reference to a couple elves, like golden-haired Glorfindel, right, in the original Fall of Gondolin, for instance. This is true of many of the characters that Tolkien writes. He very rarely gives us physical descriptions like that at all, right? I mean, what color is Pippin's hair, right? What color is Gimli's hair? does he ever say? I don't think he ever says. You know, exactly. There are some times, like with Galadriel, Tony, of course, where like her hair color is a big deal, right? So he makes a big deal of her hair color in the story. But again, he's not one for routine physical description of any of his characters. And this is certainly more true in the old Silmarillion, even than it was in the Lord of the Rings. But even in the Lord of the Rings, he doesn't usually go there. You know, and it's almost funny to me. I've known a lot of Tolkien fans who are, I've known a lot of Tolkien fans who get really, like, I don't know if upset is quite the right fair word to use, but who get really activated about the hair color of elves, right? And will like start jumping up and down if you like imagine, you know, one of the Noldor with blonde hair, right? You know, who is not Finarfin or one of his children. And I always have to admit that I'm a little bit, I don't know. I'm always a little bit reserved about that because, I mean, my goodness, if there's something which Tolkien has proven again and again that he really doesn't care very much about, it's that. So I have a hard time getting all bent out of shape about it. But anyway, yeah. Good. Yeah, Bruce, I agree. Bruce says, all I know for sure is that Boromir was a Viking. Right, yeah. No pants and a horned helmet? Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. And goodness knows Aragorn doesn't wear pants either. Right? Real men don't wear pants, everybody. That's I think all of our imaginations have been very rightly formed in those directions by films of our distant youths. Okay, anyway. Okay. So, names. Anyway, this is one last point that I want to just touch on here before we move on, is the naming after the father, right? That's pretty striking. And something which, remember what I said about maybe the laws and customs, maybe making Christopher's, you know, consistency, you know, just kind of made him twitchy, right, on the consistency thing. Because there are other places where Tolkien says, yeah, no, elves don't name their names, you know, they don't name their names after other. Now, again, in this context, he's explained the whole thing, right? We get the fuller version here. Their own names, right? The names that they name themselves, right? The names which are like their true names, which are, you know, which emerge from their Lamatiave. Those are not going to be, they're not going to share those in common with any other elf. But here, like, so Finwë's other two sons are both also called Finwë, right? It's I don't know. David Atlee is wondering if this is supposed to be a clue that there's something fishy about Finwë, that this is the second countercultural choice he's depicted as making. Yeah, I really want more kids so much that I would please like to divorce my dead wife. And when I do get a second wife, get a ruling in my favor, and I come to a mutual severance agreement with my deceased wife, then I'm going to name all my kids after myself, right? You know, Exactly. And Bruce, yes, both Jennifer and Bruce and I were all thinking about like Finwë is the George Foreman of elves, right? For those of you who don't know the reference, George Foreman, who named all of his children George, including his sons and daughters, all named George. It's exactly what it's kind of like, actually. Yeah. So. I don't know. Do I think that Tolkien is suggesting that here? No, I don't. I don't think that that we should be raising our eyebrows about Finwë here, that this is kind of a red flag about Finwë. But it's, I agree. It's a little bit interesting, right? Let's keep going. Let's plunge ahead. Okay. Now the Eldar are immortal within Arda, according to their right nature. But if a Fea, or spirit, indwells in and coheres with a Hrondo, changed to Hroa, or bodily form, that is not of its own choice, but ordained, and is made of the flesh or substance of Arda itself, then the fortune of this union must be vulnerable by the evils that do hurt to Arda, even if that union be by nature and purpose permanent. Okay, that's quite a sentence, and it's harder to follow with the changes of word and stuff. So let's do that again, and I'll skip some bits. Now the Eldar are immortal within Arda according to their right nature, but if a Fea indwells in and coheres with a Hroa, that is not its own choice, but ordained, and is made of the flesh or substance of Arda itself, then the fortune of this union must be vulnerable to the evils that do hurt to Arda, even if that union be by nature and purpose permanent. So the bodies that elves are assigned at first, so the elves have spirits, right? That is the essence of elves, and what they are is they're spirits. They're Fea, right? They're assigned a Hroa, right? They don't choose the Hroa. The Hroa is not, so despite the fact that we have this high level of coherence between the mind and the body, right? Between the spirit and the body, between the Fea and the Hroa of an elf, as he's maintained from the beginning of this whole section, that does not mean that the elves choose their bodies. Nor does it mean that the bodies are merely a physical bodying forth of the spirit, kind of like we saw with the Valar, right? That's not how incarnation works among the elves. When the spirit of an elf finds itself plopped into a body, plopped, perhaps not the best choice of verb, but you're following me, right? When they find themselves, when they're, no, I'm sticking with it. When they're plopped into a Hroa, right? They don't choose it. It's by fortune, presumably by providence, as it's kind of Iluvatar who does the plopping in this instance, right? And yet, since their bodies are formed of the substance of Arda itself, which is marred, then there might be evils intrinsic to the union of the Fea and the Hroa, despite the fact that that union is meant to be permanent. So the bodies that elven spirits are incarnated in are not chosen by them. There is, in a sense, like a different origin of their spirits and their bodies, right? They didn't make their spirits, they didn't make their bodies, they didn't choose either one, and they're put together, right? And bound together in a union which is designed to be permanent. But there can be problems. Now remember, this is one of the things that he was kind of pointing at with the whole unrequited love thing, remember? Why should they not be perfectly happy? Why aren't they like Adam and Eve in the garden? Or at least as Adam and Eve have often been understood to be, or to have been in the garden. Why is not everything hunky-dory with them? Why should there be suffering? Why should there be frustrated desire, or any of those things? Uh, yeah. Now, okay, David, you're right. David is saying this sentence doesn't say anything about Arda Mard, and you're right. I was talking about then the fortune of this union must be vulnerable by the evils that do hurt to Arda, even if that union be by nature and purpose permanent. It is possible, David, that he is there referring to about the vulnerability of the union between the body and the spirit, right, would be vulnerable by the evils that do hurt to Arda, meaning an elf's body could be killed even if Arda weren't marred. I agree with that. But it's not just the union that's vulnerable. It's the fortune of the union that is vulnerable. The extent to which the union between the spirit and body of a particular elf is a fortunate union. The degree to which that union is fortunate is vulnerable by the evils that do hurt to Arda, according to the syntax of that sentence. In other words, I take that to mean sometimes things don't always work out. The marriage between the Fea and the Hroa of a given elf isn't always a happy marriage, necessarily. And that's what makes me think that he's not saying explicitly, but pointing to Arda Mard when he's talking about how the evils that do hurt to Arda, not just do hurt to people inside Arda, right, but to Arda itself. That I think the idea of Arda being hurt, I think he is referring to Arda Mard there. Tony says, why am I thinking of Eol? Yeah, I don't know, but I mean, certainly, yeah, there are some issues here, right? I mean, heck, Tony, it kind of makes me think of Feanor to some extent. Yeah, Jennifer was just saying the same thing. Feanor's Fea Hroa, his Fea was really destructive to his Hroa. Yes, and the Hroa of many others as well. Yeah. Okay, anyway, all right, so not all is necessarily always well in the body-spirit relationship, despite the fact that we have that increased level of coherence that we've talked about. Okay. For in spite of this union, which is of such a kind that according to unmarred nature, no living person incarnate may be without a Fea, nor without a Hrondo, changed to Hroa. I'm just going to say Hroa from now on to avoid confusion. Yet Fea and Hroa are not the same things, and though the Fea cannot be broken or disintegrated by any violence from without, the Hroa can be hurt and may be utterly destroyed. Okay, so the Hroa can be destroyed, but the Fea cannot. No living person incarnate may be without a Fea, nor without a Hroa. So that sounds to me just this side of tautological. In other words, in order to be a spirit incarnated in a body, you have to have both a spirit and a body, right? There are no according to unmarred nature, no living person incarnate. Like, to be a living person incarnate means to have both. Okay. Tony's wondering if this does this eliminate soulless orcs? Possibly. Yeah, John, it does sound like that's the essence of being incarnate, right? So the essence of being incarnate is that you have a spirit incarnated in a body. There's got to be a spirit, there's got to be flesh, right? If you don't have that, then you don't have a person incarnate. Yes, I agree. That seems to be the case. But notice the Fea is not subject to violence from without, right? Harm can come to it from within, but not from without, whereas the body can be destroyed. And thus, it would seem to me, and that's why I was hinting before, that the Fea seems to be that thing which really is like the essence. If, again, the Eldar are immortal within Arda, according to their right nature, as he begins by saying here, then that basically means they're Fea, because their Hroa is not Like the Hroar of the Eldar are not, in fact, immortal within Arda according to their right nature. In a sense, I mean, they can be destroyed, right? But if they're destroyed, it doesn't mean that the elf in question is destroyed. So, yeah, Kevin is saying, is the spirit and soul the same thing as this dichotomy, the whole? Yeah, Kevin, you're asking, right, if he's imagining a bipartite or tripartite person here, right? Body, soul, and spirit, or just spirit and body and spirit. Right. Yes, bipartite seems to be what he seems to be suggesting here. I don't see any evidence, certainly here. This seems to be a two-body problem as far as Tolkien is concerned. If I'm hearing him correctly, that's what I'm hearing. I don't see any distinction there. Okay. Oh, man. You guys are always right with the really, really difficult questions, which of course is exactly, I think, where Tolkien went too. Jennifer Ewing is asking about the Fëa of the elves that were enslaved by Morgoth. I know, right? That's the trick. That's the trick. Oh no, I'm sorry, Jennifer. You're not asking about orcs. You're asking about those upon whom the spell of bottomless dread was cast, right? Hasn't their Fëa been hurt from without? Kind of seems like it, doesn't it? That's a very interesting question. He says cannot be broken or disintegrated by any violence from without. I wonder if perhaps that's not exactly what perhaps what he means there. Not that I certainly doubt that he is saying nothing that anyone from outside does can harm the Fëa in any way, because that your spirit can be wounded. We know this to be true. Like Celebrian's spirit was wounded, right? And although she was healed in body, she could not be healed in spirit, and so sought the havens, right? Elrond's wife. So I don't think that he is trying to suggest that, the psyches of elves are inviolate against anything that happens outside. What he's talking about is being broken or disintegrated. They can't be killed. No matter what happens, the Fëa of an elf will not cease. Nor will it, again, it's not that it will be utterly unaffected by everything that happens to it, but it's not gonna, the body of an elf will stop ticking, right? But the spirit never will, right? It may need some time, right, to recover and to seek healing, but not to be broken or disintegrated in the way that their bodies can be. Yeah, exactly, Kevin. They're not that kind of thing. That does seem to be the distinction that he's making here, that a living incarnate person means both things. They've got a Fëa and they've got a Hroa, but these two things aren't equal. And they're certainly not an equal part of the whole immortality gig that the Eldar have within Arda, right? That seems to be what he's getting at. Again, not that they are, as I say, inviolate to any external influence. Exactly. Yeah. Okay, anyway. If then the Hroa be destroyed, or so hurt that it ceases to have health, sooner or later it dies. That is, it becomes painful for the Fëa to dwell in it, being neither a help to life and will, nor a delight to use, so that the Fëa departs from it, and its function being at an end, its coherence is unloosed, and it returns again to the general Hron, changed to Orma, of Arda. That is, the bodies of elves do in fact decompose, right? It returns again to the general substance of Arda. Then the Thea is, as it were, houseless, and it becomes invisible to bodily eyes, though clearly perceptible by direct awareness to other Thear. Okay, Thear, of course, with the R being the plural, just to make sure that's clear. Okay. What does it mean for an elvish body to die, therefore? Right? It becomes painful for the Thea to dwell in it, being neither a help to life and will, nor a delight to use. So, if your body gets all wrecked, right, and is nothing but a source of pain, they can go. So yes, Kevin, in a sense, that sounds right. Kevin says, does that mean that elf death is ultimately voluntary? And then he clarifies, seriously coerced, but voluntary, right? Like if they, had Fingolfin wanted to stay in his broken body, right? I mean, there's Morgoth pounding on his corpse, right? The Hroar of Fingolfin took a big beating that day. But the implication of this passage, Kevin, because I'm reading it the same way you are, I think, this passage seems to imply that if he'd tried, if he wanted to, he could have stuck it out, right? His Thea was not forcibly ejected from his Hroa by his injuries, in the same way that, when the body dies, the spirit of humans seems to go away, right? Involuntarily, not with, it's not to say that humans can't choose death, but you see what we mean there. Yeah, exactly, Stephen. It wasn't really a delight to use anymore. No, his Hroa was totaled, right? But he could have done that, I guess, I think, right? The Thea departs from it, and its function being at an end, its coherence is unloosed, right? So that coherence between Thea and Hroa, which so marks the existence of elves and differentiates them, the degree of coherence differentiates them from humans, that coherence is dissolved. And so we get a decomposing elvish body, right? Yeah. Kevin says, I imagine Fëanor might have stayed no matter what if he could. Yeah, well, ironically, right, it's his Fëa, which, you talk about the Fëa consuming the Hroa, right? I mean, Fëanor is like the textbook case, right? Tarloniel says now she's imagining the Black Knight from Monty Python as an elf refusing to be evicted, right? Yeah, right? I mean, maybe he could get better. Sorry to be mixing my scenes from the Holy Grail there. Yeah. Yeah, you're not fooling anyone, Okay. That does seem to me what he suggests, the voluntary departure, right? I'm not saying that the impression that I'm getting here is that for someone to choose such a thing, right? So for somebody like Fingolfin to cling to his Hroa, right, even after it was beat up in the way that it was, right? Certainly not a delight to use, nor a help to life, right? And its function being was at an end, right? All of those things being true of Fingolfin's Hroa, had he clung to it, that would have been bad, I think. A bad sign. And I almost wonder, Kevin, if that's why Fëanor's body disintegrated. Is that perhaps a sign? Again, we're retconning now, right, with Tolkien here. Is that perhaps a sign that that was what was happening? right? That might be one version of what it looks like, especially when the spirit of fire tries to cling to his body. You know, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, Kevin, I do agree. Comparing and contrasting the deaths of Fëanor and Saruman that is interesting, I believe. Yeah, no, yeah, Robbie, we're getting there. You're right that he's many of these questions that we're raising and talking about here he comes back to them later on. I know. I'm trying not to think about those because I'm trying to focus on what he's unfolding here, because again, what is interesting to me is it's not just the story, but to revert to my ancient days back when I was a physicist in college. It's not the story itself that I am most interested when reading this. It's the delta story, right? The amount that the story is changing over time. So looking at where he is in his conception, in his world building with elves right now, right in this little glimpse, is really fascinating. And it will only be more fascinating when we see him revisit these ideas later on. So Matt, I knew you would like that one. Yeah. Yeah. But anyway, yeah. Okay. Yeah, exactly, Kevin. Exactly. Since the later versions aren't necessarily mere clarifications of this, but can well be a change of mind, figuring out what he means right now and what he seems to be getting at right now is, to me, really important. Indeed, requisite, I would say, if we're even to understand whether or not he is later merely clarifying or whether he has changed his mind, right? Only by really kind of looking at each one of them in their own terms can we really even be equipped to perceive that kind of a difference. And this is why, by the way, I have not read any of these last 3 volumes of the History of Middle-earth for many years. I have been abstaining from reading them ever since we started for this exact reason, because I didn't want to confuse because I'm so easily confused. So I've been trying to sort of stay in the moment throughout our walk through the History of Middle-earth. So now it's been so long since we started this that it's been years and years now since I've read any of this stuff. With a couple exceptions, I have read the Athrobeth since we started. Confession on my part. But the stuff in the next 2 volumes, I've not looked at for almost 10 years now, because I've been waiting for it, right? As I'm trying to live in the moment with our discussions here. Anyway. Good. Now, Marilyn says, doesn't the voluntary quitting of the Hroa conflict with his views of suicide? Great question, Marilyn. No, I wouldn't think so. In fact, this is very much like, who was it who was talking about the Númenóreans? Matt Cannon was saying that this sounds like the Númenóreans giving back the gift, right? Yeah, it sounds more like that, certainly, to me, than it does sound like suicide, or perhaps, Matt, the better way to say it would be that the Númenóreans sound like this, right? Now, obviously, it's different. Even with Númenóreans, it's different because they're mortals, right? And so for somebody to do like Númenóreans used to do back in the good old days, or like Aragorn does, we're told in the beginning of the Fourth Age, it's a different deal for them than for elves. And Marilyn, this is where it seems to me the most important difference lies between suicide and what the elves are doing here, because, I mean, what is suicide? When we're just talking about, okay, so the Fëa isn't connected with a Hroa anymore. What does that have to do with it? Notice that dies is in quotation marks, right? He's put it in inverted commas, as he might say there, right? Because it's not actually death. So in that sense, suicide is it's not that suicide is okay among elves. It's impossible among elves. I mean, you can commit suicide. You can give up on your Hroa. You can give up on your Hroa prematurely, right? But you can't, in the same way that a human can commit suicide. Yeah. Anyway, there's more on this, and we'll keep going. Yeah. Stephen says that what this and the Númenórean thing seem to have in common is both are a recognition of when it's time to leave, rather than simply deciding to give up on everything. Neither one of them, neither the giving back the gift like the Númenóreans would have done, like Aragorn did, or an elf whose Hroa is totaled, as I said. Neither one of them is submitting to despair or anything like that, right? It's like the time has come, right? There's a humility, there's a submission in that, right? Yeah, exactly. Whereas Jennifer, you're right. The idea of suicide is that it is an intrinsically violent act. It is a rejection of the connection between spirit and body, right? It's like a rejection of the gift, right? To use that Númenórean term. So again, it would be very different. Yes, exactly, Kevin. It's the willfulness versus humility is really the difference there between this kind of submission and suicide. Yeah. Good. Okay. Let's keep going. I'm not making good time. I'm going to end up doing a third week on the laws and customs. Anyway, okay. So why are elves more robust than men? Remember that? Remember, the references in the Silmarillion to how, elves are way more, like they're more resistant to cold, right? They bounce back from everything, right? Why is that exactly? What's the mechanism there? Why should that be? And remember, we were talking about this question last time about how it's possible to read Tolkien's stuff and be like, boy, elves just get the best of everything, right? Humans get the shaft. They're like, lame in everything, and elves have like all the best of everything, right? And one of the things that I was suggesting last week, we can see as a pattern in the laws and customs of the Eldar, is him pointing out it might look like that, but that's not the fact. It's not that elves are just, Ilúvatar's favorites, and men get the scraps. It looks like that because of how their systems are designed, but it's just different, not better. Anyway, so more on this mechanism. This destruction of the Hroa, causing death or the unhousing of the Fëa, was soon experienced by the immortal Eldar when they awoke in the marred and overshadowed realm of Arda. Indeed, in their earlier days, death came more readily, for their bodies were then less different from the bodies of men, and the command of their spirits over their bodies less complete. Let's pause. Let's do this one paragraph at a time. In their earlier days, my understanding of that phrase, indeed in their earlier days death came more readily, doesn't mean like back when they were fresh out of Cuiviénen, right? When like the waters of Cuiviénen were still dripping off of them, they, like they used to die at the drop of a hat, right? But then they toughened up over time. I think in their earlier days means in the entire first age, possibly first through third ages, in fact. The contrast is not between the early elves right after Cuiviénen and the later elves during the Wars of Beleriand, but rather the early elves during the whole early period and the faded elves, the post-consumption of their body by their spirit elves, the invisible elves that we were looking at and talking about at the end last time. Yeah, yeah, okay. Yeah, yeah. So this seems, my first response to this paragraph is that it seems vastly counterintuitive, right? Vastly counterintuitive because so many times we have perceived the pattern in Tolkien to be like things being stronger and like weakening over time, right? That decline over time is a pretty stable feature of Middle-earth, and not just of Middle-earth, of the earlier myths too. I mean, it's one of the things that makes that such a stable pattern is that it fits all of it, right? Generally speaking, with some aberrations, like, you know, the indication of the renewal of the trees and the reigniting of the magic sun and all that stuff from the early legends and stuff. But that's admittedly rolling the clock back, right? Not the normal pattern of things. Anyway, at first glance, this looks counterintuitive. It seems like, okay, so in the old days they were weak, but what, they're getting stronger over time? Like, boy, nowadays it's super hard to kill an elf, whereas back in the old days, you used to be, you bump into an elf and it's like, oops, I just incapacitated your Hroa there, didn't I? Sorry about that. So there's going to be more that he's going to explain about that. So, but again, I think the important thing here is that back when their bodies and spirits were related to each other like they were in the old days, it was easier for them to die. So Fingolfin getting, right, his Hroa beaten around by Morgoth in his duel, right? had he just waited, you know, several millennia, it wouldn't have happened that way. Well, no, it wouldn't happen that way because his Hroa wouldn't be in the same kind of condition, in the same kind of state. Speaking again from a physical standpoint, from a physics standpoint, state is in state of matter, right? Almost. Their bodies were then less different from the bodies of men. Again, here he does not mean now, you know, elves are what? Shorter, you know, like have much more efficient spleens, right? He's not talking about physiological differences, right? Their bodies were left different from the bodies of men in the sense that, like, when you poked them, right, you would hit something, you could like see them with like your eyes and stuff, which you can't do anymore. Remember, like that's what the fading means. That's what the diminishing means, is that they're now pretty much invisible, right? Yeah. So that's what he's talking about. So notice now another principle that he's giving us here about that coherence between the spirit and the body, right? Between the Fea and the Hroa. It's progressive. From the beginning, the Fea and the Hroa of the elves were more coherent with each other than the spirits and the bodies of men. And yet, that coherence was increasing over time. So an elf whose Hroa has never died, right? Someone who's still driving around in his original Hroa, the Hroa and the Fea are now, their relationship has gone somewhere that's completely different from you. Like they can't even be compared to humans anymore, right? The differences between the body-spirit relationship in humans and elves used to be subtle. They're not subtle anymore. Again, invisibility being an example, right, of that. And he's characterizing this note as the complete command of their spirits over their bodies. Remember also that the other metaphor that he was using to describe this process is their spirits consuming their bodies. I believe it's the same process he's describing now as the spirits consuming the bodies. All right, let's keep reading. This command was nonetheless at all times greater than it has ever been among men. From their beginnings, the chief difference between elves and men lay in the fate and nature of their spirits. Let's read, that's a sentence worth reading again. From their beginnings, the chief difference between elves and men lay in the fate and nature of their spirits. The Fear of the elves were destined to dwell in Arda for all the life of Arda, and the death of the flesh did not abrogate that destiny. Their Fear were tenacious, therefore, of life in the raiment of Arda, and far excelled the spirits of men in power over that raiment, even from the first days, protecting their bodies from many ills and assaults, such as disease, and healing them swiftly of injuries, so that they recovered from wounds that would have proved fatal to men. So why is it that elves never get sick, and elves are really hard to kill, and they can make complete recoveries from injuries that would completely destroy men? Why is that? Is it because elves are stronger, better, faster, smarter? And no, it's because the nature of their spirits are different, right? Even when they are in the raiment of Arda, meaning their Hroa, right? When they are in their body, I love the word tenacious there. Their Fear were tenacious of life. Tenacious of life. They could hold on to life because it's what they were destined for. Now think about that. Being tenacious of life. I think we were talking about the Numenorians just a little while back, right? The Numenorians become increasingly tenacious of life over time. That's bad when we're talking about the Numenorians, right? For a mortal to become tenacious of life, whether you're a Numenorian, whether you're one of the ring wraiths, right? This is bad. Because that is a violation of the fate and nature of their spirit, right? To do so, to become, as a human, as a mortal, tenacious of life, is to deny the fate and nature that you have been given by Iluvatar, right? And therefore, to reject the gifts that the other gifts that he's trying to give you. But for an elf, elves are, by their nature, tenacious of life because they are destined to dwell in Arda for all the life of Arda. And so again, even in the old days when they were comparatively easy to kill, like you could kill them by sticking pointy objects into them, as happened to many an elf over the course of the Silmarillion, right? Their bodies are slayable by swords and stuff. No longer true, right? I mean, if you were to stumble across an elf nowadays, you could not kill it by sticking it with pointy objects. That just wouldn't work, right? And even if you had the physical Hroa or semi-Hroa thing that Morgoth was in, and you were stomping on him and you were doing whatever you were doing, just like in your duel with Fingolfin, had Fingolfin endured in his Hroa into the Fourth Age and beyond, his body would not have been crushable, to use a wonderful Van Helsingism from Dracula there. Right, or like, exactly, Nancy, falling off a cliff or whatever. Exactly. So this is sort of so you see the two things that he's clarifying here, right? Elves, the nature of elf bodies has changed because their spirits have changed them. Because as the command of the spirits over the bodies has become more complete over time, those two things, the Fea and the Hroa of the elf, are now more inseparable than they were, because that coherence has become so close that, you basically can't part them anymore, no matter how you try, right? In the older days, it was easier. Again, stick them with pointy objects in their hoa, will cease to be commodious anymore, and their fea will leave it, right? Again, plenty of examples of such things in the Silmarillion. But nevertheless, they were more tenacious of life. Okay. Yet, Tony, I have no idea if the preservation given by the Elvish rings may have delayed this process in the Third Age. No idea. I wouldn't think so, as it doesn't seem to be proceeding at any greater rate among elves who are outside the influence of the Elvish rings. But, yeah. Jennifer says, yeah, so poor Glorfindel gets a new body. He's got to break in all over again. Yeah, well, we'll come back to that. We'll also come back to the Elvish rings. Later. Much later. Okay. But back to that fading business. As ages passed, the dominance of their fear ever increased, presumably over their hroar, right? Consuming their bodies, now in quotation marks, right? Consuming their bodies, as has been noted. The end of this process is their fading, as men have called it, for the body becomes at last, as it were, a mere memory held by the fea. And that end has already been achieved in many regions of Middle-earth, so that the elves are indeed deathless and may not be destroyed or changed. Thus it is that the further we go back in the histories, the more often do we read of the death of the elves of old, and in the days when the minds of the Eldaliae were young and not yet fully awake, death among them seemed to differ little from the death of men. This is what fading is, right? He's extremely explicit about that here, right? Sorry, I missed a question from before. Narnaith was asking, does this mean that their spirits are deciding not to get sick? Well, yeah, in a sense. I think the way that I would put it, based on the context from that previous paragraph, is if sickness attempts to assail their bodies from without, their spirits just, they take no guff from disease, right? They're not having it. And the tenacity of life that their spirits show rubs off on their bodies, right? They are able to, because their bodies are obedient. So yes, they can, if their hroa are banged up, but still functional, right? Still able to, their spirits can still, get them back in the game. They can make that happen, right? Whether it's disease or injury. Yes, Brian. So it's more than just an amazingly powerful immune system. That's exactly it. Again, it's not just that elves are the golden children, right? Who just are fortunate enough never to get diseases or anything. There's a metaphysical explanation, right? It is part of the destiny of their spirits enduring for as long as Arda endures, right? It is an inevitable consequence of that. Yeah. Yana, I don't think we do have any examples. Can anyone think of any examples of an elf getting sick in the Silmarillion? I mean, poisoned, right? Arathel is poisoned, but not diseased that I can think of. Not diseased that I can think of. Yeah. Tony asks, is that line in the Fellowship of the Ring about Glorfindel living at once in both worlds an influence on this concept? Possibly. I mean, yes, in the sense that it was written before this, and seems relevant to this. Yeah, I don't think he's forgotten that passage. But yeah, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, no good. Yeah, no, I agree. No, people, the folks who are dying of like grief or whatever, no, that does not count as disease. We're talking about physical contagion here. And Tomas says there's a reason that one of the names for men is the sickly, right? Because they appear to be like subject to these like diseases which just carry them off, right? Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so do I think it's relevant, Tony? Yes, I think it's relevant, but I don't think that we're yet really talking about what that passage was getting at. I think that passage is talking about more than just the Fea Hroa situation, right? Okay. So this is the sense in which the Hroa is consumed by the Fea. And this is also the sense in which they are less subject to death. So what looks like a counterintuitive incline over time instead of decline over time, right, is not actually an incline over time. It's not an increase in power by the elves, but rather an increase in dominance by the Fea over the Hroa, such that now the consequence of this is that the Hroa is now not subject to death. But again, I don't call this an improvement, right? I don't call this a mere gaining on the part of the elves in question, because notice the metaphors that are being used about this, right? Consuming and fading, right? Yes, Brian, that also seems to be a corollary. Brian asks, is it also a decrease in the ability of the Hroa to impact the world around them? Yes. The upside is that you can't any longer, it's unkillable. The Hroa is now, right? Indeed deathless and may not be destroyed or changed. Yeah, again, you can't stick it with pointy objects anymore. It can't be killed. The other side of that equation is that it can no longer stick anybody else with pointy objects, right? They're not going to be able to come and intervene in the events of the world like they could have done back in the old days. And that's the sense in which they have faded, right? And it does, Jennifer, as you say, explain why we can't see them anymore today. Yes. Now, here's one thing I'm not sure of. Okay. One thing, there's a thing that's happening here, and it's clear that it's happening, but I'm not sure exactly what's happening to it. Let's hope that makes a little bit more sense when I explain. The thing that I think is definitely happening here is he's doing some retcon with the concept of the Fading Elves. Now, you will remember, those of you with long memories will recall that is intrinsic to the elf story from the beginning. It's almost the cornerstone of the elf stories, of Tolkien's whole mythology, right? One way of characterizing in a single sentence what was the point of Tolkien's mythology back in the Book of Lost Tales days is, how did the current elf situation arise, right? Why is it that we have all these stories about elves and places that like remember elves and things, but no elves anymore, right? What happened to them? What came of the elves, right? And why can't we see them anymore, even crossing the Shire and sailing over the sea and leaving us, right? Why don't we even get Sam Gamgee's degree of melancholy about elves, right? What happened to the elves? That's in one sense, the Book of Lost Tales is a long way of answering that question, right? So that elves have in fact faded away and are no longer a part of our mortal world in the same way that they used to be is like a premise. Like that's the given from which we start his original mythology, right? And so therefore that, and again, if you don't have time to reread the whole Book of Lost Tales, or if you've jumped in with us later downstream and don't have time to read it for the first time, there's a shorter way to do this. Go to Volume 1 of the History of Middle-earth and read read Cortarian Among the Trees, the poem. It's a longish poem, but it's way shorter than the whole book. So read Cortarian Among the Trees, and it will give you a pretty good sense of the spirit of this, like the spirit of longing and sorrow and yearning and sadness about the fading of the elves, like that the elves that they are the lost people now, right? How did they get lost? What happened? Again, that was the premise of the whole mythology, in a sense, at the beginning. So, on the one hand, he is absolutely stuck with the word fading, right? Because that's an essential part of his mythology from the beginning, and it absolutely would shock me if he were to throw that word out the window. But here's my question. When I said I know something's happening, but I don't know exactly what it is. So again, what's clearly happening is he's retconning this idea now, right? He has worked out this new concept through this, this new sort of metaphysics of the Thea and the Hroa. He has now worked out a new explanation, right, of the mechanics of how the fading works. But so that's definitely happening. But here's what I don't know, if it's happening or not. Is he recontextualizing it? Is he making it less sad? Is this less sad? Is that where we're going? Is he, in fact, kind of reversing himself? And that's one reason why he's using putting the word fading in inverted commas here, right? The end of this process is their fading, as men have called it, right? Because to men it looks like they're fading, right? They're becoming invisible and forgotten to men, right? But in fact, it just means that the Thea and the Hroa are getting along better than ever before and are now an inseparable team, right? And now their Hroa is indeed deathless and may not be destroyed or changed. So one possible reading of this passage is Tolkien saying, no, I'm taking that note of sadness from all of my early writings and I'm transforming it retroactively into triumph, right? That this is not the tragedy of the elves fading from our world. This is the triumph of the elves who are fulfilling their destiny. Right? Yeah, no. Marie says, I'm not sure it's less sad if you're the one who's faded and can only interact with other faded elves. Right, exactly. As Brian was suggesting, the opposite side, the other side of the coin of your body is indeed deathless and may not be destroyed or changed is that also you can't really interact with the rest of the world anymore, right? So, yeah, like on the one hand, nobody can kill you with pointy objects anymore, but on the other hand, you can't, enjoy a pint with a friend either. There it is, right? So, yeah. Now, I absolutely agree. Tony and a couple others Jennifer, many of you are very sensibly saying that the sorrow and the tragedy is mostly from the human standpoint, right? That it's not, even in the older mythology, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's sad to the elves, what is called fading, or like the state of things which needs explaining by the mythology is sad to the elves. That is true in theory. But I would say that's not true in practice. That is to say, it seems pretty clear to me from the Book of Lost Tales that the lot of the elves is unhappy afterwards. Like that they're kind of sad too. Because it's associated from the beginning with banishment, like more than one levels of banishment. And there's the word fading, which is that's a negative word, right? It's a bad word. Like if you're fading, nothing good is happening to you if you're fading, right? Diminishing, of course, is the other word that gets used. If you're fading and diminishing, that's not a good thing. Clearly not a good thing, right? And I think to the elves in the Book of Lost Tales, at the end of things, especially the elves who stayed in Middle-earth, it's clearly not a good thing, right? But I agree with Josiah, who points out that even here in this paragraph, and I think this is very good reading, Josiah, he earlier on in the sentence when he talks about the bodies being indeed deathless and not being able to be destroyed, he says, for the body becomes at last, as it were, a mere memory held by the Fea. And Josiah's point is that mere memory still kind of sounds a little bit regretful, right? Like that's not necessarily a totally happy situation. Yeah, see, Tony, I don't agree. I don't think Galadriel is a counterexample to this. Galadriel might feel that her choice to reject the ring and to go on and to diminish is good, but it's only better than being corrupted and becoming a dark queen, right? That would be bad. Right? But that doesn't mean that the diminishing is not sad, right? Yeah. Anyway, okay, but we'll get to. I'm trying to avoid dragging in too much that isn't here in these passages here. Now, Tomas, that's interesting. Tomas says any similarities between elvish fading and wraithification induced by rings is a mere coincidence. Well, I'm not sure I'd call it a mere coincidence, but it's certainly not the same thing. But I think that there are some uncoincidental similarities between the two. The difference is that one of those things is the playing out of the natural order, and the other of those two things is a fundamental violation of the natural order, right? And therefore a warped corruption of that or other version. But other than that, the processes actually do seem to me kind of similar, actually. That, you know, as I said before, Tony, I though I don't think he's forgotten the passage, I don't think that passage about Glorfindel existing on both sides is necessarily behind this stuff. But, you know, Tomas, I am less sure that the business about becoming invisible permanently, as Gandalf says, would happen to you if you went on fading, right? I'm not at all sure that he's not thinking about that passage here, especially since the word fading is being used in both, right? So it seems to me more likely, that he has that parallel in mind here. Twisted, warped parallel, right? Yeah, in flavor, Tony, it is a little bit like the way in which the vampirism of Dracula in Bram Stoker's book is like a warped and twisted version of the resurrection through Christ. Yes, yes. Yes, that's kind of interesting. Actually, it's a really interesting parallel. Yeah, kind of like that. Kind of like that. Okay, let us continue our extremely efficient. Oh dear. Okay. It was in Aman that they learned of Manwë that each Fea was imperishable within the life of Arda, and that its fate was to inhabit Arda to its end. Those Fear, therefore, that in the marring of Arda suffered unnaturally a divorce from their Hroar, remained still in Arda and in time. But in this state, that is, after the Feas lost its Hroa, in this state they were open to the direct instruction and command of the Valar. As soon as they were disbodied, they were summoned to leave the places of their life and death and go to the halls of waiting, Mandos, in the realm of the Valar. If they had obeyed this summons, different opportunities lay before them. The length of time that they dwelt in waiting was partly the will of Namo the Judge, Lord of Mandos, partly at their own will. The happiest fortune they deemed was after the waiting to be reborn, for so the evil and grief that they had suffered in the curtailment of their natural course might be redressed. Oh, what a sentence that last one is. Holy cow, can of worms. But anyway, let's go back to the first paragraph. Okay, so what about the spirits? So we've been talking, right, about this coherence between the body and the spirit, and what happens to the body over time, and the tenacity of life and all this stuff. So, but what happens when the separation does occur, right? Okay. What actually happens to the spirit of an elf after it, quote, dies, right? Okay. Notice, first of all, that this separation between Fea and Hroa, occasioned by violence or whatever, right, is characterized as an unnatural divorce. An unnatural divorce. Remember, it is the purpose and destiny of the Fea and the Hroa to be married continually, right? They're supposed to stick with that body. That's plan A, that your Fea and your Hroa are what you get, right? Even though, remember, sometimes it doesn't always seem to work out, right? You don't choose your Hroa, right? You don't choose your family, you don't choose your body, right? Your body is just given to you, but it might be, for all that it's an arranged marriage, it's a permanent marriage, or meant to be, envisioned as a permanent marriage between their bodies and their spirits. And therefore, the destruction of their bodies, or the near fatal wounding of their bodies, is characterized as an unnatural divorce. So what happens to the Fea? It remains still in Arda and in time. See the very important emphasis here? What happens to their spirits after death? It doesn't leave the building, right? Wherever it is that men go, right? The spirits of men go after death, wherever that is and whatever's going on there, that is not where elves go, right? There is no afterlife for elves. Their life continues here in Arda and in time, right? All that happens is a change of state, right? All that happens is a change of state. They were married happily or At least hopefully their Fëa and Hroa were kind of rubbing along together well enough, right? But now they've been split up, the Fëa and the Hroa. So they've lost their Hroa, but the Fëa, and that's why, again, I've been saying from the beginning, the Fëa seems to be, by Tolkien's metaphysic here, the essential elf. Like, that's what the elf is. It is a spirit. It has a body. That seems to be true of Tolkien's elves. They're not really incarnate peoples if they don't have both, right? But, you know, if you lose, if the two of them split up, they're not split. The elf is the Fëa, right? And the body decomposes. Remember that the body ceases to be part of the team anymore, and that's why it decomposes and returns to the stuff of Arda, right? So here it seems fairly clear that the Fëa is essentially the elf, and the Hroa is more, okay, well, I was going to say accidental, in like the Thomist sense of that term, like in the Aristotelian sense, but that might not be helpful. In any case, it is the Fëa, which is the elf. Okay. But in this state, so notice another thing. Not only does it remain still in Arda Indian time, not only does it not go somewhere else, does it not leave the world, right? There's no tunnel with a light at the end for elves when they die. There's not even a local transportation, right? It's not even like they just wake up back in the resurrection circle, right, where they last saved their game. That's not, like, what happens with the elves. Their spirits are summonable at that time. They don't automatically go to Mandos. When an elf dies, it doesn't wake up in Mandos. That's not how it works. In this state, they were open to the direct instruction and command of the Valar. So when they are pure Fëa, right? When they are now independent of their Hroa, of their bodies, the Valar can communicate with them more directly. Open to the direct instruction and command of the Valar. As soon as they were disbodied, they were summoned to leave the places of their life and death and go to the halls of waiting. Summoned to leave the places of their life and death. So, when an elf dies, where is the Fëa? Right there. Right there. Looking, presumably, at its Hroa, right? And equally, apparently, from the context of this paragraph, hanging out, right? Hanging out in the same place. And from that place, the places of their life and death, they're called to the halls of Mandos. Not compelled, not transported, summoned to that place. If they obeyed this summons, they don't have to obey the summons. They could stay, right? You can't force them. You call them. In other words, remember that business about the summoning of the Valar, right? And anybody who says that the Valar summoning of them was a bad idea lies with the tongue of Melkor. Remember that, right? So the summoning of the Eldar to Valinor is merely a foreshadowing of this other summoning, or this is an echo of that, or whatever, right? If you'll indulge me for just a minute, and I know I've only got about a minute, but if you'll indulge me for a part of that minute in making reference to the Silmarillion film project, Marie, I bet you're thinking the same thing too. When in the film project, which I won't go into too many details, I promise you, But in our creative film project, when we were discussing our season 2, which went from the awakening of the elves at Cuivian and through the darkening of Valinor, so it was about the elves being called to Valinor. The dominant theme of that season as we were planning it was the question, where is Elvenhome, right? Where do elves belong? Do elves belong in Middle-earth? Were they put here for a reason? Is this their job? And going into the West, is that a kind of abdication of the role that they were given originally by Iluvatar? Is that how things are? Or is the West where they really belong? Is that their true home? And to stay in Middle-earth is lingering, right? Is itself, that's the true evasion, right? The true separation, the true failure to fulfill their destiny, right? Which is the case. So that question, which seems, by the way, to me, an open question, I can see arguments on both sides of that question from within Tolkien's corpus and kind of going back and forth in some ways at various points in Tolkien's corpus over time. But that was the question, which I thought was a really interesting question, that we were kind of allowing our theoretical retelling and adaptation of the stories to be kind of wrestling with in that season. Here, Tolkien seems to be answering that question fairly clearly, if I'm reading it correctly. Between that earlier reference of like, there is a 0% chance that the Valar were wrong, right, to invite them, and now the way that the summons is being characterized, right, makes it seem much clearer that at this point in the late 50s, right, Tolkien is thinking, yes, they belong in the West. They belong in the West. One way and another, they belong in the West, I think. And that's interesting. But if they obey the summons, the length of time that they dwelt in waiting was partly the will of Namo the judge, partly at their own will. So they are not allowed out. They have to remain in waiting in the halls of Mandos. If they obey the summons, they are subject to the sentence of Namo the judge, right? They're compelled to remain in waiting, compelled after they voluntarily answer the summons, but also partly at their own will too. They could opt to remain even after their required period of waiting, if they want to. And apparently some of them do. But they deem that the happiest fortune, the best option though, every elf's plan A. Okay, plan A is not to get killed in the first place, but plan B, if you are killed, right, is to answer the summons, go to the waiting in the halls of Mandos, do your time, right, profit from that time, and then get reborn. So that the evil and grief that they had suffered in the curtailment of their natural course might be redressed. Don't ask me what that means, because I don't know. In what sense it's going to be redressed. That's the word which seems to me fraughted with meaning. Yeah, seriously frauded. But for now, no, hang on. A couple of you are thinking about Glorfindel. This isn't what happened to Glorfindel. Glorfindel is later. Don't think about Glorfindel, because this isn't about Glorfindel. We're not talking about coming back into Middle-earth, getting wumping up a new Hroa and sailing back to Middle-earth. We're talking about being reborn. Baby a second time. Incarnated again as an embryo or whatever. A zygote, probably. Right? Nancy says, I thought he gave up on that. Yeah, me too. Well, we're out of time. Here's what I was laughing about, and several of you will, I know, appreciate this. I was going to try to get through the whole of the laws and customs among the Eldar last time, and I got about halfway. Tonight, I was trying to do the other half of Laws and Customs among the Eldar, and I've gotten halfway through tonight's slides. This means we are on pace to finish Laws and Customs of the Eldar. Never, right? We are on pace to we're gonna keep doing half of the slides every week, and we will never reach the end of Laws and Customs among the Eldar. In like theoretically, it will never happen. Exactly, Xeno Strikes Back is exactly what we're looking at. That's what I was laughing about just a few minutes ago when I looked down at how many slides we had left. Was realizing that I'm making a reality of Xeno's paradox here, which is hysterical. But anyway, so next time, next time, I totally promise. I was really confident we were going to get to the Necromancer this time, and we totally didn't get to the Necromancer. But next time, we have two really juicy issues to talk about, and that is rebirth thing. Because Nancy, you're right. Like, holy cow. Here, we'd finally gotten to the point where he gave up on the Valar having kids, right? Which was like one of the very last of the old Book of Lost Tales concepts that was like being phased out, right? That we sort of, I mean, there are a bunch of things like being familiar with the published Silmarillion and stuff. You read the early materials and you're like, whoa, that's different. Like that's going away sooner or later, right? You know, including like the fact of the Valar having kids and stuff, you know, and to this point now we've got, you know, that example, right, of the Valar having kids looked like it was one of the last of the old ideas to fall off finally, right? And now, boom, we're back having elf babies again, right? We're straight back to congratulations, it's a boy. In fact, it's Grandpa, right? There we are. Back to that again. How does that work? Why does that work? Why is Tolkien going back to this? We will see. Jennifer says, and Odo shows up behind Gandalf on the horse. Exactly. So, next time, the reincarnation of elves and necromancy. A how-to guide in next week's discussion. And this time, I'm just going to say it. Let's think about let's entertain the possibility that we might escape the snare of Xeno's paradox and get through the end of the Laws and Custom among the Eldar and continue. And after that, let's go back and talk more about the divorce of Finwë and Miriel. Because I don't know about you, but I really am keen to talk more about the divorce of Finwë and and Miriel. Yes, Arthur's remembering the old song, I'm my own grandpa. Yeah, exactly. Literally true for elves, right? Absolutely. So anyway, okay. So if you're feeling as optimistic as I am, do go ahead and read a little bit more about Finwë and Miriel, and we'll see how far we get next time. So, all right. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night. I will see you guys next week. Bye now. The Mythgard Academy has been offering in-depth discussions of awesome books and films since 2013, completely free to attend and free to download. If you've enjoyed our discussions and would like to help them continue, please consider donating at signumuniversity.org/fund.